welcome back to another episode of the Women's Policy Action Network discussion series. Today, we're going to be talking about all things e-commerce and what it looks like to be a woman in that space. To help us guide this discussion and better understand it, we're joined by Anishka De Zylva. Anishka is a public policy and communications professional who is passionate about leveraging technology to solve some of South Asia's most pressing challenges. She advises businesses and governments on a broad range of issues related to the digital economy and rolls out programs, campaigns, and partnerships to improve policy landscapes and public perceptions. She is currently the head of corporate affairs at Daraz, a leading online marketplace in South Asia. Thank you so much for joining us today, Anishka.
Sure.
So let's dive straight into it and let's discuss about the current trends and growth patterns that we've seen in e-commerce in Sri Lanka, because we've seen the rise of e-commerce globally. What does that look like in Sri Lanka at the moment?
So e-commerce is definitely growing in Sri Lanka, and actually it existed prior to COVID. But what COVID did was it really deepened that trend and propelled e-commerce forward as an industry. And in terms of growth patterns and trends here in Sri Lanka, there are few that I can highlight. The first being that e-commerce is really an island-wide phenomenon. And this was revealed through the recent Daraz/com report on e-commerce that was published earlier this year. And we saw that across Sri Lanka, people are using e-commerce, and it's very much youth-oriented, it's startup-oriented. Both men and women are using e-commerce to shop online and to sell online as well.
Right.
But when you look at the payments side of e-commerce, cash on delivery is still the preferred payment method.
Okay.
And that we'll need to see that change for e-commerce to continue to grow and thrive in the country and to contribute to Sri Lanka's digital economy. Broad estimates suggest that as a share of retail, e-commerce is still, say, not as prominent. So it's around, say, 1.5% to 2%. But these are very broad estimates. More research and studies need to be done to sort of get a much more definite estimation of the share of e-commerce in retail, but it's growing, and we sort of expect that share to grow over the next 3 to 5 years. We're also seeing trends like, say, big shopping experiences, like the 11/11 sale that's driven by Daraz. We're also seeing Black Friday sales and things like that, which are all associated with the e-commerce world now, getting associated with Sri Lanka's retail industry as well. So those are some of the, say, broad level growth patterns and trends that we can see here in Sri Lanka.
Right. So I'm guessing sky's the limit for e-commerce in Sri Lanka.
Yes.
So what are some of the major, if you could put it into a couple of words, the broad challenges and opportunities for e-commerce business in Sri Lanka?
Sure. I'll start with the opportunities,
right,
because I think that's a little more exciting. So internet penetration in Sri Lanka is still not 100%.
Of course.
So both national and international estimates suggest that internet penetration is around, I think it's like 45 to 67%. So national estimates is around 45%, and then international estimates like the World Bank have estimated it to be around 67. And we have a good smartphone penetration. I think of the number of mobile users, Learn Asia has estimated around 63% of those users own a smartphone. But what that shows is there's still segments of the population that need to get access to the internet, that need to get access to smartphones, which means that the addressable market for e-commerce is likely to grow over the next 3 to 5 years, which is a big business opportunity to capture those markets and those consumers for businesses. And then, of course, the second big opportunity is global market access. E-commerce really gives businesses or retailers an opportunity to cater to consumers, not just in Sri Lanka, but also in other parts of the world. And we're seeing more sellers, both small and medium businesses, but also say larger enterprises, looking at how they can get their products across and market to consumer bases across the world, which is a great export earning opportunity for Sri Lanka as well.
Definitely.
And of course, the third, say, most well-known opportunities that e-commerce has, say, less costs associated with it than, say, starting up physical stores. So you
Definitely,
can
yeah.
start an e-commerce store relatively quickly compared to trying to start up a brick and mortar store. So we're seeing that as a big opportunity, particularly for entrepreneurs, where they can very quickly start selling a product to a consumer base, not just in the area in which they're producing, but across the island.
Okay.
When we look at challenges, there are a couple of challenges associated with e-commerce, and one I would sort of like to highlight is the distribution network here in Sri Lanka.
Okay.
So distribution or logistics here in Sri Lanka is really set up for traditional commerce. So for retailers, it's not really set up for the consumer. So most often we see sort of sellers or businesses struggling to get their products across to consumers in a timely and efficient manner. So platforms like Daraz try to reduce those sorts of challenges by giving sellers the option of going with Daraz's last mile delivery service, Daraz Express. So as a seller on Daraz, you can Daraz Express delivers your products for you, but
Okay.
we'll need to sort of see distribution and logistics networks in Sri Lanka catering to the e-commerce market as well, and not just to, say, traditional retailers and distributors. And we will need to sort of see that grow and evolve to be able to for sellers to be able to get their products to consumers in a timely manner, because with e-commerce the delivery time is extremely crucial. Consumers want to get their products fairly quickly. So sort of investing and improving on that will be key. And then, of course, the slow adoption of digital payments. Cash on delivery is still the preferred payment method. And for e-commerce to grow in Sri Lanka, we would need to sort of see people switch from cash on delivery to prepaid digital payment methods, mainly because giving cash on delivery as an option to consumers is quite costly to businesses.
Okay.
Because you need to manage cash, you need to manage the refunds.
Right.
There are a lot of sort of expense heavy operations that need to be or expensive operations that would need to be carried out to facilitate cash on delivery.
Right.
But of course, as trust in e-commerce players and in e-commerce related businesses grows in Sri Lanka, which we should see more the adoption of digital payments growing, but we also need, say, all stakeholders to work together to really drive digital payment adoption in Sri Lanka. So that is both businesses, the banks, the government, everybody sort of working together to really incentivize consumers to adopt digital payments. So those are some of the, say, high-level challenges related to addressing the consumer market here in Sri Lanka, or catering to the consumer market here in Sri Lanka. But when we look at e-commerce, say cross-border e-commerce, Sri Lanka does not, say, have as many logistics connections as, say, other countries. So it's quite expensive for sellers to send products to consumers abroad. So we need to sort of develop partnerships, logistics partnerships. We need to increase Sri Lanka's logistics connections with other countries to then reduce the cost of sending cross-border e-commerce packages through the various distribution systems or logistics connections. So those are the sort of the main areas I'd like to highlight in terms of opportunities and challenges.
Yeah, I mean, definitely, I think we've all faced our issues with, not timely deliveries. And also, I think we'll get into digital payment systems in a little bit. But Anishka, what do you see as the incentive for customers against using digital payment systems? What is the preferred, in your experience at least? Why is there such a preference for cash on delivery?
I think it's because there is no perceived explicit cost with cash on delivery.
Right.
When it comes to cash on delivery, there is no explicit additional cost to it. Whereas any digital payment method, there is a very explicit cost to making that payment.
Oh, yes.
For example, if you do a bank transfer, there is a fee that you need to pay. If you pay with a credit or debit card, sometimes there is an additional fee that you
Right,
need to
okay.
pay. So there are the costs associated with digital payments are quite explicit, whereas the costs associated with a cash payment are not so explicit. In addition to that, I think consumers also need to build trust with the seller, because all
Right.
sellers in the e-commerce industry are relatively new.
Yes.
So it's new names, new sellers, new products. So the consumer is really keen on actually getting the delivery before making the payment, because they
Right.
want to make sure the order reaches them. It's
Okay.
not necessarily that they want to see the product, but they just want to make sure the delivery gets to
Right,
them.
that they get it. So it's a
And
bit
they
of a
get
trust
it.
factor to it, right?
Exactly. There is a bit of a trust factor. But as e-commerce grows and consumers also get used to the players, the processors, and the systems that support this this mode of commerce, then we are likely to see them trusting the system more. So there needs to be, say, more trust in e-commerce for digital payments to grow as well.
Okay, and that's something that will happen over time, right?
Yes, and it'll happen, say, a lot faster with well thought out interventions that can be implemented by both the government and the private sector.
Right. So we'll get into that in a little bit, Anishka.
Sure.
But let's talk about how you spoke about how how much easy it is to get into the e-commerce space. You don't have the red tape of setting up your own brick and mortar store. And I think a trend that we've seen, and a trend that you've also have seen, is that there is an increase in women taking part in e-commerce, especially on the seller side of things. So what exactly is the representation of women in the e-commerce sphere, and how has it evolved over time?
Okay. So yes, so as I mentioned, both men and women are shopping online, and they're also selling online. And a lot of that data can actually be extracted from the Daraz/Com report, which looks at the gender aspect of e-commerce. And just to sort of quote a couple of statistics from that. So the report indicates that 56% of e-commerce users who identified as sellers were men. So 56% of the sellers were men, and 44% of the sellers who were surveyed were women, which is actually very good. So there are small gaps, but they're basically on par.
I mean, it's definitely better than the labor force participation that we have right now, which is, I think, at 31%.
Yes. So we're seeing both men and women engaging in e-commerce as sellers. And actually, the ILO recently released a report on the impact of crises on SMEs, micro, small, and medium enterprises. And they actually highlighted a very interesting statistic, which is that 40% of women-owned businesses used online sales as a coping mechanism during Sri Lanka's crises, whereas only around 27% of men-owned businesses used online sales as a coping mechanism.
Right.
So we're also seeing that women are, say, more open to adopting e-commerce to overcome various challenges related to retail or selling online than, say, men, which is, I think, a great finding, and one that should be sort of investigated more.
Yeah, definitely. As to
built upon, because it's very interesting. And when you look at the consumer side of things, the Daraz/Com report indicates that 63% of the surveyed women shop, or 63% of those who shop online are women, and 70% of those who shop online are men. So again, we're seeing that there's almost equal representation, even in terms of shopping online as a consumer. So it's very exciting for Sri Lanka, because I mean, there's no there's no magic bullet or one solution,
Right.
but e-commerce can really be leveraged as a mechanism that can increase female labor force participation, that can bridge certain gaps between men and women when it comes to commerce and when it comes to income earnings and things like that. So it's, I think, a very interesting space that should be looked at in terms of development interventions.
Right. So speaking of interventions, currently are there any specific programs or initiatives that are looking to promote the involvement of women in the e-commerce sphere at all?
There are a couple actually.
Okay,
So
that's great.
yeah, so the ICTA, which is, say, the main ICT body for Sri Lanka currently, they have one such initiative. It's actually called Suhurulia, which was launched in 2016 in collaboration with the United Nations Asia Pacific Center for ICT. So the program really focused on developing or building the ICT capacities of women entrepreneurs.
Right.
So they launched it in 2016, and there was a phase 1 that was completed. And some of the key highlights include around 17,500 women entrepreneurs being trained through this program. They
Wow.
also have private sector contributors to the program as well.
Right.
I think Meta is one of those
Okay.
contributors. And they are launching a second phase of this program sometime this year or early next year. I'm not exactly sure of the date, but we've seen the government sort of initiate such programs to enhance women entrepreneurs in the e-commerce sector. A second program that comes to mind is actually Daraz's own Arya Shakti program, which was launched 2 years ago actually.
Right.
And this program really focused on encouraging more women to engage in e-commerce by giving them a special onboarding package and specialized trainings and programs and things like that. So there are programs like this that exist, but we can definitely do more, and we should do more to ensure that women are engaged in this sector.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, the numbers speak for itself, right?
Yeah.
Like, we have women participating in the e-commerce sphere on both ends, both as retailers, both as sellers and consumers. And it's great to see that there are initiatives that are pushing forward, and not just sitting back and saying, you know what, we have enough participation, like some sort of checklist or a quota system has been fulfilled. So I know we spoke about a couple of overarching challenges and barriers. Anishka, are there any specific ones that women face in e-commerce?
Yeah, sure. Actually, a couple come to mind. And I'll highlight maybe 5 of them. So the first, and I would say one of the most obvious barriers to women accessing the e-commerce ecosystem is access to funding.
Right.
So many women encounter difficulties when it comes to securing loans, investments, and say venture capital compared to men.
Okay.
So we need to make sure that women entrepreneurs get equal or equitable access to financing that will help them grow their businesses, both
Right.
locally but also internationally. And you have organizations like Hatch that do great programs related to this. They're not, say, only focused on e-commerce,
Okay.
but there have been great examples of women who have benefited through programs, say, launched by Hatch, like Accelerator and various things like
Right.
that have allowed them to set up e-commerce businesses, gain the funding that they need to access international markets. So definitely access to funding is one challenge. The second is limited networking opportunities. So say compared to men, women tend to have less opportunities to learn from peers.
Okay.
And to network with others in their same say sector or their same industry. And in recognition of this, actually Daraz launched the Women in E-commerce conference that was hosted last year, and that was hosted this year as well. And this was also one of the key findings that came out of that conference, where many women came to the conference and said, look, like, it would be great to have more of these, more opportunities to speak to our peers, to speak to others who have, say, faced similar challenges to
Right.
us, or to others that are, operating in the same sector or industry as us. So I think just a more concerted effort to ensure that women are much more engaged in, say, conversations related to e-commerce, or that they also have networking opportunities, is going to be key. And then another sort of challenge is, of course, balancing work and family.
Right.
So while e-commerce gives women a lot of flexibility, it enables them to work from home, we also have to be careful that the double burden isn't created.
Okay. Yeah.
Where in addition to running an e-commerce business, they're also taking care of the elderly, or taking care of children. So there is a balance that we need to strive for, as we sort of encourage more women to join the labor force through e-commerce. And interestingly, say, this of course is just, say, anecdotal,
Okay.
but women also sometimes tend to negotiate less than men sometimes.
Okay.
So which means that even when it comes to setting up their business and negotiating supply and things like that, you may have men may get a better deal than women, simply
Okay.
because they negotiate with suppliers better.
Right.
Whereas women tend to sort of take the first price that's given to them. So it's
Okay.
like, so that's just like an interesting observation. And then of course there is the challenge of ownership. So sometimes you'll have a women-owned business or a women-run business, but the males in the household tend to sort of be the figurehead of that business, or speak on behalf of the women or the woman, and sort of try to control the ownership.
Okay.
Rather than sort of the woman owner of the business sort of taking ownership and driving it herself. So those are a couple of challenges that women face, both at a macro and, say, a micro level. Yeah.
All right. So thank you so much for that. So I mean, I know we just spoke about the barriers and challenges that women face. So let's move on to a little bit of a lighter side of things. Are there any examples of success stories of women who have excelled in e-commerce in Sri Lanka?
Yeah, I think one actually that comes to mind is Richard Stationery.
Okay.
So Richard Stationery is a manufacturer and distributor of in notebooks and paper-based stationery. So it's a stationery company.
Right.
And they both cater to the local market, and they export as well. And one of the key leaders of that company is actually a woman entrepreneur. Her name is Angela Richard.
Okay.
So she's a director, and the company has grown significantly online through platforms like Daraz under her leadership. So I would say at a very, enterprise level, her story is a great example of a woman entrepreneur that's come into the e-commerce sector and really harnessed the opportunities and embraced the challenges and sort of driven growth through online sales. And then, of course, we have the, say, micro, smaller businesses. Daraz has a program called Daraz Connect, which we do with divisional secretariats, where we work to educate rural entrepreneurs of the benefits of e-commerce. And there's one of the sellers, she's a lady, she makes woven bags.
Okay.
And she said that, until she attended one of the Daraz Connect workshops, she had no idea that she could use Daraz or platforms like Daraz to sell her products.
Wow. Okay.
And now she's really growing her business through through the Daraz platform, but I believe through other platforms as well. So she's taken that knowledge and she's applied it to other platforms as well, and she's selling her products and she's growing her business. And recently, she hired an employee as well, which is great to know, because now
Yeah.
it's not just her; she's giving
Yeah.
jobs to others. So there are various stories like that of women, both at an enterprise level and even at a micro, small, and medium business size level, that have really excelled in e-commerce.
Okay, I mean that's great to hear that it works on both ends of the spectrum, right? When you
Yeah.
look at the macro things of a say, already established enterprise breaking into the e-commerce world, because we can see, I think, at least anecdotally, you can see a lot of the bigger retailers not so willing to engage in the e-commerce sphere, right? Because I mean of traditional business movements that they have. And you always expect, e-commerce platforms to be driven by startups only,
Yeah.
and just a micro seller that you think of, at least when you think of e-commerce. So let's get into digital payment systems, Anishka. And this is a
Sure.
personal gripe of mine, because for the life of me, I've been trying very hard, at least I think for the past 5 years, to go cashless, and to integrate digital payment
Yeah.
systems. But there seems to be a lot of resistance, um, on both in terms of e-commerce or even just normal, day-to-day transactions. So let's dig into that a little bit.
Sure.
So how have digital payment systems evolved and expanded in Sri Lanka? And are there specific challenges? I know we spoke about it a little bit earlier, but to the adoption of digital payment, and what does it look like in terms of it being addressed?
Okay. Sure. I hope your experience changes soon. So digital payments in Sri Lanka has definitely evolved. We're seeing the introduction of more digital payment solutions, from banking applications to QR code payments, buy now pay later applications, and then we're also seeing the mobile wallet activations and things like that. So definitely digital payments is growing, but the growth has been slow.
Right.
And sometimes I think it has even stagnated.
Okay.
And we need to see more parties or stakeholders coming together to really drive that and incentivize the consumer to also switch to digital payments. Because actually Sri Lanka has a very robust cash system that works very well, right? There are no sort of major issues in our cash system.
Right.
So for digital payments to grow, there has to be some sort of incentive for consumers to switch from paying in cash to paying through a digital payment method. And in addition to that, sort of there needs to be much more interventions around creating awareness of the convenience and the security of digital payments.
Right.
And as we see those being implemented and launched and unfolding in Sri Lanka, we're likely to see more of a shift towards digital payments. So in e-commerce, again, like digital payments is pretty much integrated in e-commerce ecosystems. Like if you take the Daraz platform, for instance, you can pay through a buy now pay later application. You can pay through Daraz points. You can pay with a credit or debit card. You can pay with a credit card through installments, these various options. But we still do have the cash on delivery option, because a majority, say 70% of users, prefer cash on delivery. But hopefully through concerted efforts, we'll see that change over time.
Right. Yeah. I mean, if 70% of your users prefer cash on delivery, I mean, there's very little you can do other than to incentivize them through other methods, right?
When it comes to looking at digital payments and e-commerce, another sort of important point to mention is that we are also seeing banks collaborating more with e-commerce, say companies or platforms, to encourage prepayments or digital payments. So I don't know if I'm sure many people have seen, certain days of the week you can get discounts using a certain credit or debit card from a certain bank. So we are seeing the banking sector sort of take a more proactive role in terms of driving digital payments with e-commerce partners, and that's encouraging, and we need to sort of see more of that in the
Yeah.
future.
Okay. So Anishka, what do cross-border opportunities look like for Sri Lankans trying to penetrate these international markets? And are there any sort of, small wins that can be addressed so that this looks easier for our e-commerce industry?
Sure. So when it comes to cross-border e-commerce, there are, say, 3 points I would highlight. And the first is basically there are several opportunities
Okay.
for Sri Lankan businesses when it comes to cross-border e-commerce. But to access those opportunities, we have to fix the supply issue in Sri Lanka. So many sellers in Sri Lanka depend on imports for stock. And if cross-border e-commerce is to grow, we need to start manufacturing more locally. We need to start producing more locally. And sellers need to invest more in local production and start creating products that would appeal to, say, global markets and audiences. We're seeing that happen at the micro, small, and medium entrepreneur level. We're starting to see, and I think Instagram and even platforms like Daraz, it's full of these, where producers are starting to, say, produce jewelry or shoes or kitchenware or homeware. Locally, and they're making it aesthetically pleasing to, say, a global audience, but we need to see more local production. When we start producing more locally, we will the opportunities to then export those products internationally will be created at a much faster rate. So that's one. And the second is, Sri Lanka's strategic location is a major opportunity as well.
Definitely is.
We are the gateway to the Indian subcontinent, and there are massive consumer markets that Sri Lanka can cater to, not just India but even Pakistan and Bangladesh and Nepal. And similarly, there's the Middle East, and there's also East Africa. And particularly in South Asia and in East Africa, e-commerce is also sort of in its early stages, or it's still maturing. It's, say, not as mature as other say European markets, or
definitely,
or the US and Canada. So the fact that Sri Lanka is very well positioned to cater to these maturing e-commerce consumer markets is a huge opportunity that producers and sellers should leverage. And of course, if you do have the capital, you can also look at capturing market share in the Southeast Asia e-commerce market, but that market is quite mature and very saturated with fierce competitors similar to India. But there are, say, vast there are much more diverse markets that Sri Lanka can go into. And in all of these markets where e-commerce is maturing, many of the consumers are just looking for, great value in terms of good quality products at great prices. So keeping that in mind, businesses can expand and really look at getting their products out there and exporting. And sort of the third point that I want to highlight is the role of platforms and marketplaces. We are seeing that platforms are streamlining and reducing the complexities around accessing global markets. So it would be important for sellers or producers to think about, how do I leverage a platform to access consumers outside of where I'm located? And it would be prudent also for, say, all other relevant stakeholders, be it the government or others, to really look at how do you leverage platforms to grow cross-border e-commerce. So yeah, I would say those are the three areas I would highlight when it comes to cross-border e-commerce.
Okay, so thank you so much for that, Anishka, and in general, just thank you for coming on today and helping us better understand how e-commerce looks like in Sri Lanka and what the gendered aspect of that looks like. Because I think universally a big policy narrative that is driven in increasing female labor force participation is the inclusion of of digital e-commerce, right?
Yeah.
And what that looks like, and from what I gathered from today's discussion, is that Sri Lanka is on the right steps in terms of increasing digital e-commerce participation, just as a state. But also women are also making strides within the e-commerce sphere, and I think that's a promising outlook for all of us.
Thank you. And it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for inviting me. And I hope these insights are useful to future research related to e-commerce, but also to policies related to e-commerce. Thank you so much.
So thank you for watching. And follow this space for more on this discussion series, and subscribe to our Advocata Institute YouTube channel and all our other platforms. Stay tuned for more episodes.